Hey YouTube, welcome back to another episode on the Artist Forum. I wanted to make a video for music producers, mixing engineers, mastering engineers. One of the things that they really deal with a lot in their artistry, one of their tools, is dynamic range adjustment of their audio. This is like a basic tool, but really it's an essential tool. And being able to really know how to adjust your dynamic range of your audio is really key and important. So I wanted to make a video on this. It's going to be I'm not going to really spend a lot of time talking about different kinds of compressors, let's say, but I really just want to get to just the fundamentals of understanding what compression's really doing, what expansion's doing. Towards the end of the video, I'm going to sort of go into talking about through the Fourier series, how really in audio, when you adjust something, you change something, you really don't get anything for free. And I hope you take some time to go through that part of the video and really understand what I'm talking about. But I want it to just be, I really felt like I had to include that section to just really explain what the audio waveform, what parts of the audio waveform have particular, most likely the frequency components in that waveform. And through the Fourier series, I was better able to explain that, and how when you're using a compressor and you have a faster attack time and you're really, really hitting that transient, how that's really changing the tonal balance of your audio. So I hope you take some time and go through that part of the video, but with that said, let's get into the video. All right, so adjusting your dynamic range of your audio, ways of doing that. Really, first of all, what is dynamic range? And really, technically, the definition of dynamic range is really the loudest part of your signal, your waveform, to really the quietest part. And the quietest part, I would say, would be sort of around the tail end of your audio waveform, as you can see here in this picture here. But really, the dynamic range is just, it could be said in dB or whatever, but it's really just, again, the loudest part to the quietest part. Now, when we're going to go in and talk more about compression and expansion, you really sort of need to understand parts of this waveform that I want to talk about, and that's really like, let's say, the higher amplitude, louder part of the signal, which could really be around this transient part of the waveform, and then you have the lower amplitude, quieter part of the signal. Because when we're talking about compression and expansion of the waveform, you really need to sort of think about it in terms of these sections of the waveform. So how I've always thought about dynamic range and adjusting it, I always thought about it like this, as you see here. If you have on the top left, when you see higher amplitude, louder part of the signal, and on the bottom you see the lower amplitude, quieter part of the signal. If you go from the higher amplitude, louder part of the signal, and you make it quieter, in a way you're really compressing the waveform. Or if you take the lower amplitude, quieter part of the signal and you bring it up, in a way, again, you're compressing the signal. Now, the opposite is sort of also how this works here, is that if you take the louder part of the signal and you make it louder and you leave the quieter part, the same, in a way you're expanding the dynamic range. You're expanding that waveform. You're taking that already loud part and making it louder, but leaving the quieter part the same. You're expanding it. You're increasing the dynamic range. So I would first say that compression is decreasing the dynamic range, Expansion would be increasing the dynamic range of your audio. Now, like I was saying, types of dynamic range adjustments. You can have what's called downwards compression, where again you're taking the higher amplitude, louder part of the signal and leaving the quieter part the same, and you're basically bringing down that louder part of the signal, and you're pretty much, in a way, downwards compressing it. If you take the quieter part of the signal and bring that up relative to leaving the louder signal the same, you're doing what's called upwards compression. Now, if you take the louder part of a signal and make that louder and leave the quieter part of the signal the same, you're doing what's called upwards expansion. If you take the quieter part of the signal and bring it down and leave the louder part of the signal the same, you're expanding the dynamic range of the waveform still, but it's called downwards expansion, typically like what gates would do. All right, so before I get into, just quickly discussing what the settings are for what, if you use a compressor or an expander, I first would just like to show sort of what are the transfer curves of what a downwards compressor or an upwards expander does here. So let me show you for each of these 4 examples what the transfer curves look like. And so the first one here, you can see a downwards compressor. Basically what's going on here is that you see we have, and what I'm going to talk about in the settings is you have a threshold. This is typically the point where the compressor, the expander, is going to do whatever it needs to do. In terms of a downwards compressor, what happens here is everything below the input, when the input is below the threshold, it is not doing anything, and it's typically on a 1-to-1 ratio, meaning the output is the same as the input. But then when the input gets above the threshold, we're going to bring down those louder parts, thus decreasing the dynamic range. If we go to an upwards compressor, it's sort of the opposite. Everything above the threshold, when the input is above the threshold, the upwards compressor isn't going to do anything. It's on a 1-to-1 ratio. But then when the signal drops below this threshold, we're going to bring those quieter parts up, thus again now decreasing the dynamic range, upwards compressing. When we get to upwards expansion, everything, when the input is below the threshold, it's on a 1-to-1 ratio, but then when we go up, when the signal goes above the threshold, instead of doing the opposite of what, it does the opposite of what the downwards compressor does. Instead of decreasing those louder parts, we're actually going to increase those louder parts. And in essence, increasing the dynamic range. A downwards expander, typically like what a gate does, is that when the signal goes above this threshold, it doesn't do anything. It like opens the gate, let's say. It's a 1-to-1. It doesn't do anything. But then when it goes below the threshold, you're going to bring down those quieter parts and increasing the dynamic range. Okay, so before I go on and show sort of how to use some of the settings for compressor and expander to really sculpt and manipulate the waveform, I just wanted to show you using this multi-band compressor where I've set it to just the full band. But I just want to show you how it's sort of, compressing or bringing down or increasing the waveform for, say, a downwards compressor or an upwards expander. Because this is a really versatile compressor, and it really helps to see sort of what I was talking about before about the 4, versions of dynamic adjustment. Downwards compression, upwards compression, upwards expansion, downwards expansion. So let me just start here and show you that with this single guitar note that I have, I'm going to loop it. I'm going to start with downwards compression, and you set the range to a minus number and you put it to compression. That's going to do downwards compression. So when I play this waveform, I set the threshold that we discussed in the previous section. That's really just, where it's going to start to compress. But notice, this yellow line really is showing what's really happening here with downwards compression. It's as it goes above the threshold, it's just quickly pulls down and compresses and brings down the signal. And that's sort of what I want to show in this part of the video, is that with this compressor you can really start to see that. Now if I want to do upwards compression, I'm going to basically change the range to plus. And notice now what's happening here is that as the signal goes above the threshold, it goes down to 0 gain, but then as it goes below that, I'm trying to bring up those quieter parts of the signal, and that's in essence what this is doing here. Just as the transient hits, it's not going to compress it at all, but then as it goes below that, it's trying to gain up, it's trying to bring up those quieter parts of the signal. If I do upwards expansion, I'll change it to expansion, and I'll do upwards expansion. Again, what's happening here is that you can see initially it's trying to bring up, as the input signal goes above the threshold, it's trying to quickly gain up more of that signal. And notice you can see here that it's even going into the red, it's clipping. But that's what it's trying to do. It's trying to even accentuate that transient. Again, as that input signal goes above the threshold, it's trying to gain up and increase the gain of that waveform, thus increasing the dynamic range of the waveform. Now if I do downwards expansion, basically what's happening here, you can see, is that when the input signal goes above the threshold, it doesn't want to do anything. It goes to 0 gain. But then as it goes below that, it's acting like a gate now. It's trying to attenuate that signal, and thus now increasing the dynamic range again. So I just quickly wanted to show that with this compressor. It's really nice how you can see what it's doing with the gain and how you can hear it, and then how it's sort of either trying to increase the gain or decrease it. So I hope that was beneficial to you. All right, so real quickly, I'm just going to go over the settings that you will typically find in a compressor and expander. And then in the next section, I'm going to go into a little more creative aspects of changing some of these settings of what you can do with the waveform. But with a compressor expander, you're gonna see all of these settings, and they're pretty much the same. As you'll see a threshold, a ratio, a knee, an attack, and release. But with a compressor, the threshold is really just setting how low of in the input signal is the compressor going to start to bring down the peaks of the waveform. Or in the expander, it's going to be when is it going to start to increase the peaks of the waveform. The ratio is really just setting the deviation from the 1-to-1 of really doing nothing, the deviation from that curve. How much compression am I doing, or how much expansion am I doing? The knee is also really important, where if you have a harder knee, which is typically where you're not really doing any compression up to the point where you just immediately kick into compression, can typically be a lot easier to hear and not really as desired. That can sort of be known as an artifact with compression, where because of that you want to have more of a softer knee where it sort of gradually kicks into the compression, as opposed to, again, the harder knee where it just dramatically kicks in and you can just hear it. It's less transparent with a harder knee. The attack and release times for a compressor or an expander are really just when the signal goes above the threshold or below it. It just depends on whether you're doing downwards expansion or whatever. Again, it's just the time it takes for the compressor, the expander, to manipulate the audio. With a compressor, it's the time it takes for it to start to compress the peaks. With an expander, it's going to be the time it takes once the input signal goes above the threshold, the time it takes for the expander to start to increase the waveform. The release is now going to be when the waveform has gone above the threshold, and then when it goes back below it, it's going to be the time that it takes for the compressor, the expander, to sort of return to nominal unity gain. I would say an often overlooked setting in a compressor, or for that matter an expander, is really the makeup gain. And what I mean by that is that when I'm going to go into the next section about using these settings to sort of sculpt the waveform, you're going to be doing a lot of gain reduction, and that's going to sort of bring down the average level of the signal. Well, the makeup gain is going to help bring that back up to a nominal decent level, and that's why it's so important. A lot of people might get caught up in just the attack and release, but really use the makeup gain to sort of bring back that sound, the average level of the waveform after you've started to compress it. With an expander, you might actually have to bring it down a little. One setting that I want to just briefly go into is the look ahead. Now, it sort of helps the compressor, especially when you're dealing with like faster attack times. It's supposed to help the compressor deal with faster transients. If you have a fast attack time, it sort of gives the compressor time to deal with that. Now, there could be a couple things that it's doing here, and I don't really know which one it is because I've looked in the manual and it doesn't really explain what it does. But typically, I've read that look-aheads can either, one, start to compress before it sees the transient, meaning that if you have a fast attack time and you want to compress the transient and you have a look ahead of say 2 milliseconds, it will start to actually compress 2 milliseconds before the transient even happens. And that's sort of a helpful thing with music production, is that sometimes when you're doing side chaining, sometimes you want to duck right before you have the side chain. And that's another video we can go into about certain side chaining techniques that you can do. But I don't know if this compressor is typically, if it's doing that or if it's doing this other thing where it really just delays the signal so the side chain of the compressor and the detector has time to really prepare for that. I don't really know. So just take some of those things into account. And then we'll get into the next section here where you can start to use these settings to sort of manipulate the audio. All right, so I want to go into a couple examples of using the settings for a compressor and an expander to sort of show ways of how you can manipulate the waveform. With this first example, I want to sort of show how you can accentuate the transient, the attack part of the waveform. So what I'm going to do is play you the waveform here. Now, if I want to accentuate the attack part of the waveform, what I probably want to do is I want the attack time of the compressor to be fairly long. I want to really let that go through the compressor without it being affected. So I will probably choose a decent attack time right now. And what I like about this compressor is you can really see the waveform, and you can see that the lighter gray part of the waveform is the output and the input is the more darker gray. So you can sort of see what's already happening here, that the initial transient hasn't really been affected much. Around a little after it is. But let's say now what I'm probably going to do is I'm going to lower the threshold to about the point of the waveform where I want to let the release start to really sculpt the body of the waveform. And what do I mean by that is that I'm going to increase the release time. I'm going to make the compressor have to take longer for it to go back to unity gain. Because right now it's pretty fast, and you see how it quickly just comes right back up. As you can see here in the red gain reduction curve. But as I increase the release now, you'll start to see that it takes longer, and takes longer for the compressor to go back to unity gain. But in a way, I'm sort of lowering the body of this waveform. So you see how it's taking longer now. So if I make it fast release again, you see how it just comes right back up. The body of the waveform is really, it hasn't been affected much. But if I take, the release, the compressor take longer to recover, I can really start to shape that body of the waveform. So now with a longer attack and a longer attack, I really haven't affected the initial attack, the transient of the waveform. But with the threshold and the release settings as they are, I've sort of affected the body of the waveform. So now if I use a setting in the compressor that I said was often overlooked, which is the makeup gain, I can, you see, I can bring out the attack a lot more because really the attack hasn't been touched, but I have still a lot of gain where I can bring it back to where it used to be at the input. So as I bring up the makeup gain, notice that the initial transient is a lot louder now, but I haven't really touched much of the body of the waveform. Okay, so another example I'd like to show is one way is I would like to the way I like to sculpt the waveform using a compressor is I would like to keep the transient. I don't want to affect it that much. I will make a faster attack time, and I will sort of have the compressor clamp down on it a little bit. But what I want to do is I want to sort of more accentuate the body of the waveform. I want to bring that out more through makeup gain and other things. So let me show you how I'd probably go about doing that. So let me play the waveform here. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up the threshold to a point where I can, up to a point of how much of the body I really want to start to bring out in this waveform. So I'm going to make it a little bit higher of a threshold. So, see anything below here, I want to really start to bring that out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to probably make the attack time a little faster. So as you know, I'm starting to affect the initial transient of it. But what I want to do is I want to make a faster release time too, because I don't want to really affect the body of that waveform there, right below the threshold. Because if I made it longer, you see how it takes longer to come back up. So if I make it a faster release time, it will just quickly go right back to unity gain, and I'm not really affecting that body of the waveform. But now, again, if I go back to the makeup gain, you see how I can really start to increase. See, the body came up a little, whereas, back now at the initial transient, it was where it was before. But now I've really increased more of the body of the waveform. So by using the attack and combinations of the release and where I set the threshold, I've really been able to accentuate more of the body of the waveform. All right, so I just want to show another quick example of an expander and how you might go about using an expander to sort of sculpt the waveform. With this expander, it's going to be sort of what I tried to show in the previous, in the first, like compressor, settings. What I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to really accentuate the initial attack of the waveform. And an expander is a great way to do that. But I'm also going to sort of adjust the attack time to sort of, see how much of it I want to, gain up or don't want to gain up. So let me play the, let me bypass it first, and I'll play the waveform for you. And again, with this plugin, it's really nice. You can see what it's doing to the waveform, the input and the output. So when I unbypass the plugin, you can see I've got it in upward expansion mode. See where I've set the threshold. Now I've really accentuated. Let me bring down the level a little bit. But what you can see is I've really accentuated that transient part of the waveform. And if I increase the attack time, it'll just, it takes longer for it to do that, and it doesn't do it as much. But if I make it a lot faster, it just really accentuates that transient part of the waveform. All right, so the last part of this video, I sort of want to go into and explain when you are dealing with dynamic range adjustments, And if you think you're just manipulating the volume of the audio, you really aren't. You're really affecting the frequency components of it and the tonality of it. And really, when you're dealing with these dynamic range adjustments, you really don't get anything for free. I'm going to have to go through what's called like the Fourier series to sort of explain that. But I also want to sort of explain how the frequency spectrum of a waveform is really, the higher frequency information of that waveform, say the transient part of a waveform, is really going to be the higher frequency information, and then maybe sort of the body of the waveform is going to be more of the lower frequency information. And I'll go through the Fourier series as well to sort of show you and explain to you why that is. All right, to better show what I'm talking about with how waveforms are made up of frequency components, and how really when you're dealing with dynamic range adjustments, you really don't get anything for free. We first need to talk about the Fourier transform, how to go from a discrete time representation to a frequency domain representation. So as you see here in this video on the right, you'll see a discrete time representation of an audio signal. And then on the left, you'll see its frequency domain representation of it. Now, as you see here on the right, you'll see the discrete time representation of this audio waveform. To go to the frequency domain representation of it, you have to do what's called the Fourier transform. That's called analyzing the sequence, analyzing what frequency domain components make up this discrete time representation of it. And then to go from the frequency domain representation back to the discrete time representation, you're sort of doing the inverse of that. You're synthesizing the sequence. Now, a lot of people might have heard of the FFT, the fast Fourier transform. Just know that going from the discrete time representation to the frequency domain representation by doing the Fourier transform, that Fourier transform was quite a computationally intense calculation. A lot of engineers started developing algorithms to quickly compute the Fourier transform, known as the fast Fourier transform. So just know when you hear the FFT, that's typically what that's referring to. All right, so now that I've sort of showed you how we go from the discrete time to the frequency domain for a signal, I want to sort of show you now how a complex waveform is really built up of its harmonic components, and how even the transient, the attack part of a waveform is really more built up of the higher frequency components, as opposed to the more body of the waveform is built up of the lower frequency components. So in order to do that, I have to sort of explain now the Fourier series and what that is. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to build a square wave of just sinusoids of really odd order, a sinusoid, and then it's odd order harmonics. So if I take this first, a fundamental frequency sinusoid, a continuous wave of 25 hertz, and I do its Fourier transform, you can see that, when I do the Fourier transform, just like when we're looking at an EQ, like I showed you, we're seeing the frequency components of it, the 25 hertz. Now, if I add the third harmonic now to it of a certain coefficient, a certain amplitude, and I add that to the original fundamental, you can start to see in the yellow waveform how I'm going to start to build up a square wave out of this. And if I do the FFT of it, you'll see that I have the fundamental, and then I have the third harmonic component of it. Now, if I add up to about the 17th harmonic with different amplitudes for each one, you can see in the gray now I've built up almost like a square wave waveform. Now, a lot of the ringing is called the Gibbs phenomenon, and it's don't worry too much about that, but just know that I've now created a square wave of all these harmonic components of just sinusoids. And what I want to really show out of this is that really the attack part of it, how how I started to really build up that initial transient part of the square wave really came from a lot of the higher frequency harmonics that you can see here. And more of the body of this square wave is really more built up of just the fundamental, the warm part, you would say, of this tone. So even though it's down to 25 hertz, just know that, I mean, it's still, maybe you'd be around 200 to 300 hertz of a audio waveform. But just know that by going through this Fourier series, that I'm sort of showing you how a complex waveform is built up of all the harmonic components, and a lot of the attack part, the transient part of that waveform is really going to be more of the higher frequency information, and more of the body of it is going to be more of the lower frequency information. So now that we've discussed a lot of how a waveform is built up of these harmonic components, let's say I basically, in a way, compress this waveform, this square wave that I built up. So as you can see here, I sort of am affecting the attack, the transient part of this waveform. That's so what a compressor would probably do to this waveform. And now you can see when I do the Fourier transform of this, or the fast Fourier transform of this, you can see that from the non-compressed waveform to the compressed waveform, the non-compressed waveform has all the harmonics up to a higher frequency, and then even now the compressed waveform, the higher frequency components are less, they're lower in amplitude, even down into the more the fundamental part of the waveform, the frequency parts of it. And I can also discuss that, you start to see some of the even order harmonics. That's because of having to deal with some of the duty cycle being affected here by the compression that I was sort of doing here in Excel. But just the point to really know here, and it really, it ties this last part of this video, that ties in this last section here, is that even if you think you're just adjusting the volume, the dynamic range of a waveform, because you're affecting the transient, the attack part, and even the release of a waveform, you're really adjusting the timbre, the tonality, the frequency components of it, and really you're in a way filtering it. You're a lot of people would say when you really have a fast attack and you're really adjusting that attack of that waveform, it sounds a little more muffled. Well, that's because you're really getting rid of these higher frequency components. So I know this last section was pretty technical, but I had to go through all that to really explain to you what is sort of happening here with the waveform. And by doing even just dynamic range adjustments, compression and expansion, you really are affecting the tonality of that waveform. All right, so in closing with this video, I really would just like to first thank you for going through it and watching it. And I know towards the end it got a little technical, but I really felt I had to sort of say and show what is going on with the waveform, how you do have frequency components of that waveform, and how it, by manipulating the waveform, you really are affecting the frequency components of it. But this video, I hope was beneficial to you. Please, put any comments in if you'd like me to go into anything further about this video, anything for future content you would like me to discuss. But I really wanted to also show in this video that there's more to just compressors and, even expanders. I mean, there's things that we can talk about in another video about parallel compression, where, if you basically do like upwards compression, in a way you can sort of do like a nice form of parallel compression. You're not really affecting the attack part of the waveform. You can really just bring up the quieter part of the waveform. In essence, it's kind of like parallel compression. But that's a discussion for another video. But I just hope you sort of got a lot out of this, sort of starting to understand the tools that producers, mixing and mastering engineers, they have to deal with. I mean, mastering engineers, they have to be really, really surgical with how they adjust the dynamic content of their audio. So, I mean, mastering engineers really have to know a lot about, certain kinds of dynamic range adjustment tools like compressors and expanders and which one to use. I hope this video was beneficial to you, and I appreciate you again for watching. And please come back again and leave comments if there's anything else you'd like me to talk about in future content. So once again, thank you very much.